Good afternoon. I'm Trina Sheets, Executive Director of NEMA, and I'm your moderator for today's webinar, Energy Resilience, Lessons Learned from Clear Path 4 and Cascadia Rising National Exercises. At this time, it's my pleasure to introduce our presenters for today. They are Mr. Robert Ezelle, Director of the Washington State Division of Emergency Management, Ms. Deanna Henry, Emergency Preparedness Manager for the Oregon Department of Energy, and Mr. Jeff Baumgartner, Senior Advisor, Infrastructure Security and Energy Restoration at the U.S. Department of Energy. We're very pleased to have each of these individuals and very experienced subject matter experts with us today. We hope you enjoy the webinar. Robert, I'll turn it over to you to get us started.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. And Trina, thank you for this opportunity to talk about ClearPath and Cascadia Rising, both really truly major exercises from which we garnered some very valuable lessons learned that I'd like to talk with you about today. And I'm going to talk really from an overarching emergency manager's perspective, sitting at the state level, coordinating between tribal, local, county, federal, non-governmental, and kind of gives us perhaps a different way of looking at things. From a stage setting perspective, I'm going to start with Cascadia Rising. It was a major exercise that took place from June 7th through June 10th of this year, and it involved a regional response to a major rupture of the Cascadia subduction zone, which sits just off the coast of Washington, Oregon, and Northern California. The exercise was the culmination of 2 years of hard work across local, tribal, county, state, federal, private industry, and voluntary agencies. It also linked to several high-level Department of Defense exercises that played out during our Cascadia play window and the following week and a half. It actually involved thousands upon thousands of participants and really truly was a heavy lift. I talked about our lessons learned during a workshop at the NEMA Annual Forum in Chicago, and I'm going to try not to repeat too much of that information, but do want to spend some time addressing the perspective we gained from the exercises. We do exercises to test plans and assumptions, rehearse actions, and gather lessons learned. And Cascadia Rising 16 was the first time we played a major earthquake scenario on this scale. In terms of lessons learned, the exercise was wildly successful. We gained volumes of data that will help us to refine plans, work on how we communicate, fix processes, etc. However, to me, the most valuable thing I took out of the exercise was perspective. From studies and predictive analysis, we knew how bad the event would be. Bridges down across the region, roads blocked, airfields damaged, power out across the region, communications out. Really, everything that we depend on to live our 21st century lives are going to be gone or severely degraded. Add to that the tsunami that's going to strike our coast, causing thousands of deaths and massive devastation. The magnitude of need that's going to come out of this event is going to be much greater than anything that our country has seen before. And this leads me to my first point. You cannot look at a catastrophic event as being similar to the other events we regularly experience, just on a different scale. It really is not. A catastrophic event is truly different and must be approached differently. The systems and processes we use in a normal event are just not going to work in a catastrophic scenario. There's not time to conduct assessment, figure out what resources are going to be needed, and then push resource requests up the chain from local to county to state to federal, and then figure out what's needed, and then push them back down the chain, and then have them flow into the area. That's not going to work, because unlike hurricanes, floods, winter storms, and most of the other disasters we see, earthquakes are no-notice events. If you have a big one, your initial response is going to be mounted with what you have on hand. It's going to take time to open up the transportation infrastructure to get resources to you. At the same time, there's going to be massive and overwhelming. In the case of Cascadia, millions of people live in western Washington and western Oregon. And they're going to be without basic life-sustaining services to include shelter, food, water, until help gets into the area. So we don't have time to assess that need, figure out how to mount a response, and then start flowing things into the area. Because the additional challenge is the infrastructure over which we need to mount our response is going to be severely damaged. That means that roads, railroads, airfields, ports, and things are going to be severely impacted. So these things are going to have to be open and open quickly if we're going to be able to get life-sustaining and life-saving commodities going into our area. At the same time, the infrastructure needed to support the response is going to be severely damaged. Communications will be out except for limited public safety communication. Energy is going to be a key issue. Power will be needed to keep public safety facilities, hospitals, and government operating. Fuel supplies to power response is going to be severely restricted. And I say all this to make the point that we're going to need a different planning paradigm if we're going to really truly prepare for an event the magnitude of a Cascadia subduction zone rupture. I've already talked about the inefficiencies of the NIMS way of requesting assistance. In a catastrophic event, we're going to be needing to seamlessly transition from a pull system of requesting assistance and resources to a push system in which needs are pre-identified and resources are automatically pushed to the places of identified need. A lot of work has already taken place planning for an event of this magnitude, but the plans are conceptual in nature and not detailed execution level planning. We need to partner across communities, across infrastructure sectors to identify needs and anticipated resources, and then plan ahead to get those resources into the area where and when needed. There's also a significant requirement for continuity of operations and continuity of government planning. Many responders may be victims who are unable to get to work. This includes workers in the energy sector. Government at all levels and in private industry need to engage in interrelated planning to ensure that we're able to provide or quickly restore essential services. All of this has implications for individual, family, and business preparedness. People must be able to survive on their own until help arrives. This includes having stockpiles of non-perishable food, water, medicines, etc. First responders and key workers need to have that same level of preparedness so that they will be able to take care of their families and then respond to their place of work or their alternate. We did not have much scripted energy play in Cascadia Rising. However, we had representatives from Donovan Power Administration and local electric utilities testing our EOC. We scripted a 2-hour policy session with representatives from the Governor's Office present to discuss fuel distribution and resupply following a catastrophic event. A Cascadia subduction zone rupture is going to be every bit as devastating to the energy infrastructure as it will be to the transportation infrastructure and the rest of our lifeline sectors. We anticipate power being out across the state. In discussions with BPA, they anticipate Eastern Washington being restored relatively quickly, but Western Washington is going to be a much different matter. Restoration there will require intense coordination between transmission and distribution providers. The grid will not be restored all at once. We will most likely see islands of power restored that will gradually expand as time progresses. However, it may be a couple of years before power is restored to more isolated coastal communities. And this has significant implications for our state's ability to recover from a COC event. At a macro level, power is required for all of our critical infrastructure. If power fails, the other sectors are going to fail short of their own or their ability to generate their own power. And much of our critical infrastructure has generators, but then this ties over into fuel. How long can those generators keep running absent regular supplies of fuel coming into the area? How long can generators powering cell towers keep running before they run out of fuel, dropping off whatever cellular communications remains? How many cell towers even have generators? And this leads to significant policy considerations that we're going to have to start getting our arms around. Just some of the things we're thinking about: should Washington State require a fuel station to have emergency generator capability or a minimum of emergency generator hookups so that we can access fuel in tanks? Should we require communications providers to have generator capabilities at all of their sites and towers so that they can keep their infrastructure up to the maximum extent possible? The questions are endless and point to the work we must do to ensure that we have a comprehensive energy strategy to deal with the really big one. But this is where it starts to get tricky. Much of our energy infrastructure, in Washington at least, is privately owned, which means that we're going to need to build public-private partnerships to address the many energy types of issues that we're going to be facing in a Cascadia event. Even more importantly, how do we partner together to build energy resilience so that when the big one does happen, our infrastructure does not completely fail, or what does fail can be restored much more quickly. Our big takeaway from the exercise is that energy, particularly electric power and fuel, need to be key focus areas for our planning going forward, as they are both critical to our ability to respond to and recover from a major disaster. I spoke earlier about the need for detailed execution level planning. The same needs to happen for ESF 12. We need to pre-identify restoration priorities to determine where scarce resources go first. But also, energy planning needs to fold into the overarching logistics planning. Massive amounts of material are going to be flowing into our area over very constrained transportation infrastructure. Where will energy resources fit into the overall logistics plan? Do they take priority over food and water, over communications equipment, over search and rescue? Is fuel more critical than power, or vice versa? These are just some of the questions we've got to do the hard work of answering. Going to Clear Path 4, many of the lessons that we learned from that exercise are the exact same ones that we gleaned from Cascadia Rising. Communications is paramount. We need to be able to talk with one another following a disaster, but just as importantly, we need to know who we must communicate with and what information is important to them. And so until we form the habitual relationships across our community, that's still going to be a struggle for us, because many of us, at the state level, we're not used to talking with many of the local utilities providers and making sure that there are robust networks between the various providers that we have here in the state. So that's going to be a point of emphasis for us going forward. And as I mentioned earlier, we depend on energy to support the systems and stuff of everyday life. Power loss is going to cause cascading effects across our society and across our infrastructure. I'm an emergency manager and not an expert in the power grid, but I get the impression we're not exactly sure how a major disruption is going to cause cascading effects across the grid and into neighboring states and regions. So I think that there's also some work there on that needs to be done. There's great complexity in how we manage a widespread outage. As I said, our electrical power infrastructure is both publicly and privately owned. This opens up questions as to government's role in a major outage impacting multiple power providers. What is Washington State's role in working with Bonneville Power Administration to establish priorities for transmission restoration? What's our role in working with Seattle City Light, a municipal utility? What's our role in dealing with Puget Sound Energy, Washington's largest privately owned utility? Again, the questions keep rolling on and on coming out of these exercises. The bottom line is that it's going to take a partnership at all levels of government and private industry working together to figure out how we're going to respond effectively to and recover from a major event. The challenge is that we need to do this now, before the event, and not after it happens. And finally, there are always implications for preparedness. How do we really truly prepare for a major event? What plants need to be built? What supplies need to be stockpiled? Where do you stockpile them so that they're available after a disaster? Do you put your supply yards in the tsunami inundation zone, or do you put them out of it? It sounds like an elementary question, but it's not necessarily that easy from a perspective of policy. In closing, shortly after Cascadia Rising, we had an opportunity here in Washington State to sit down and do a grid retreat with members from the National Governors Association, utility providers, Department of Energy, to again discuss more of what we saw in Cascadia Rising and what we need to do going forward. And we've all agreed that there's a lot of work that needs to be done. Our Department of Commerce, which has the lead for ESF 12, has agreed to take the lead on trying to come to grips with many of the challenges that I've outlined. There's a whole lot of work that needs to be done, and we're excited to get started. And that concludes my comments, and I'll turn it over to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. That was excellent. Deanna?
Yes, thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Deanna Henry with the Oregon Department of Energy, and I'm going to talk specifically on the lessons learned from a petroleum sector from ClearPath 4 and Cascadia Rising. Just want to tell you briefly about Oregon's situation. We are extremely vulnerable to any severe and long-term petroleum shortage because the state has no refining capabilities. So we import 100% of the refined petroleum products that we use here in the state, and the bulk of that product, more than 90%, come from four refineries located in the Puget Sound area of Washington State. And those refineries provide product to us through a 230-mile pipeline, the Olympic pipeline, all the way down to our Portland fuel hub. And we also receive some product by tanker vessels. And whether the product comes by pipeline or by the tankers, it all enters into Oregon through the Port of Portland, and that's where our 7 petroleum distribution terminals are located within a 6-mile area, all sitting on very liquefiable soil. So this is our Portland fuel hub. We do get a small amount of fuel from refineries in Utah and California. Once product gets into our fuel hub, we do have a 6-day fueling cycle, and 2 pipelines, barge service on the Columbia River, and a fleet of about 1,500 tanker trucks distribute fuel throughout Oregon to some 2,400 retail fueling outlets. That's our normal supply system. We do have had many studies on the Cascadia scenario, and we can expect that in Oregon we will lose 100% of our incoming supply. There's a 2013 earthquake seismic study by our Oregon Department of Geology and Mineral Industries that found that the Olympic pipeline that provides the bulk of our state's fuel was largely constructed in the 1960s when Cascadia hazards were unknown. So as a result, we can expect some widespread damage along that line so that we will not be receiving fuel from that line. The study also showed that out of the hundreds of fuel tanks in the Portland fuel hub, only about 3 are expected to survive a catastrophic earthquake. Whether those tanks would be operable afterwards, that's yet another question. These are 3 newer tanks that were built after 2004 when the city of Portland did start requiring new construction projects, including tanks, to start addressing liquefaction concerns. So this report also showed that our 3 marine docks that are currently permitted to receive fuel would not likely survive a moderate quake, let alone a Cascadia one. So what we've done is, understanding our vulnerabilities, we have been working to develop the Oregon Fuel Action Plan, and this plan identifies what fuel allocation might look like in the aftermath of catastrophic earthquake. And our plan does identify 9 priority actions that our agency will take to try to begin the recovery of the fuel infrastructure in our state. Some of the highlights include we have procedures for how our agency would be working with industry, US DOE, and the state of Washington to try to assess the severity of the damages to our infrastructure, estimate timelines for repairs and possible timelines for restarting some of these facilities, which would be months if not longer. Some of the actions also detail how our agency would be working with our priority users to assess each sector's fuel needs, of how they would apply for emergency fuel, and coordinate the delivery of the supply to some pre-designated fuel points throughout the state. Of course, this activity has been ongoing because we have to do that before an emergency actually occurs. Other things that our plan describes is how we would work with our governor's disaster cabinet to prioritize the state's overall fuel needs. And because this is a multi-state event, our plan also identifies how we might coordinate with US DOE, the state of Washington, and other states as needed to coordinate regional priorities involving fuel. And the plan also identifies protocols for how we would request and coordinate with FEMA, US DOE, and industry to secure bulk fuel supplies for delivery from outside of the region into the state to support our ongoing emergency response and recovery activities. And finally, our plan does provide procedures how we would coordinate with federal and state agencies to secure necessary waivers to ensure the timely delivery of fuel when we do have it. All of these actions do lead to Action H, which is the crux of what our agency would be doing, is trying to get fuel to the folks who actually need it. And so our focus is to provide fuel to those who save lives, protect public health and safety, and to restore critical lifeline services. And allocating fuel to this sector is huge. Even though Oregon's not a big state, we do have 120 state agencies with varying degrees of emergency response duties and capabilities. The state has 36 counties with more than 240 cities, each with their own emergency and essential services providers. So our agency could easily be overwhelmed if we were to receive fuel requests from all of these entities individually. So we had to streamline our process and design a structure for fuel allocation that would actually be managed by our agency. So those who qualify for emergency fuel now fall under 3 categories. Our priority users include our 18 emergency support function primary state agencies, our 36 county emergency management agencies, and our 9 federally recognized tribes. So all fuel requests will be filtered through one of these 3 priority users. And again, these are things that we are working on right now, so we're not guessing who those folks are after an event. Our pre-approved priority users do have some responsibilities, and our state, county, and tribal leaders understand this. We've been working with them for a couple of years now to ensure that they have identified what their critical missions are and have a general understanding of what the fuel is needed to perform those missions. And we've worked with them to designate fuel points of distribution ahead of time. Each county will also need to assist their counties, special districts, and regional governments to also do this work. These fuel requests from the city, special districts, and regional governments will be coordinated and submitted through their host county's application process. Again, as Robert suggested, that we can't do this like we would normally do it, so we're already going to have this information ahead of time. So, and this is consistent with what Oregon Emergency Management Structure is for a resource request with local governments for all other hazards events. So once the bulk fuel supplies are delivered to the receiving points at the counties, each of our counties do know that they are responsible for having a plan to get the fuel from the point of distribution to their critical facilities and emergency responders in the field. And the tribes also understand this as well. So in both the ClearPath 4 and Cascadia Rising exercises, it really helped us increase our overall understanding of the federal response structure and how it really integrates with our state fuel plan. And what was extremely worthwhile was getting to interact directly with industry and DOD's Defense Logistics Agencies in the Fuel Task Force breakout session during ClearPath 4, because we were able to discuss how bulk fuel supplies would be obtained and delivered to Oregon at a very high level. This allowed us to really focus our attention during the Cascadia Rising exercise on testing the different components of our Oregon Fuel Action Plan, which is specifically, what we're going to do with the fuel once it arrives in Oregon. We're also extremely helpful and thankful for the ongoing support of the U.S. DOE staff from Region 10, who on an ongoing basis would answer our questions about the federal response structure and the protocols, and gave us great insight into the federal process and how the states can best engage. And they also develop critical situational awareness information and damage assessment data on the impacts of the region's infrastructure during both exercises. So kudos to the Region 10 staff, because they also came to Oregon to learn more about our plan prior to Cascadia Rising, so that this really helped increase the effectiveness of our overall exercise play. So we gained so many valuable lessons from both exercises, and we definitely want to continue engaging all the federal agencies in our ongoing efforts to continue our fuel planning efforts. But some of the specific actions that we learned from the exercise is that initial damage assessment. You know, we thought we could do it on our own, but it was very clear, and even from the lessons learned from the Japan earthquake, us in the impacted area, it's very hard for us to even get out to communicate with anyone during that first week, let alone do effective damage assessment. So we're going to be heavily reliant on US DOE, the EIA, NASIO, and others to really gather that data for us on the impacts of our region. They're going to be able to do it much quicker than we are and be more effective about it. So they will be providing us actually the damage assessment information. And the one thing in the exercise that wasn't very realistic was the fact that we were getting all this information by email. And I'm not sure after a catastrophic earthquake if that's possible, but I think that's where it's key that the US DOE liaisons that respond to our state EOCs will play a key role in providing us situational awareness and damage assessment. So we certainly want to continue working with US DOE to improve our overall coordination of requests for damage assessment data on the energy infrastructure, including flyovers. There was a lot of people asking for flyovers during the exercise, and you know, I think we need to better improve our coordination of that. And since Oregon expects to lose 100% of our state's regular incoming supply from a Cascadia scenario, our plan does work with state and local agencies to rely on the existing in-state supplies for their initial life-saving functions until we can get a bulk fuel supply in to sustain their response. So we do have a spreadsheet listing all above and underground fuel storage tanks in the state listed by county, and this information also includes fuel type, storage capacity at each location. It also identifies those locations with backup power. And so for this exercise, we work with 3 counties to assess the likely supplies that are available after a Cascadia quake based on the information from their county spreadsheets, how long the supply might last them, and discuss some concerns about access to those locations and supplies. And fueling locations like motor pools and public works yards and other state and county-owned fueling locations pose no problem for access other than, you know, we can't get there because of roads. However, the counties express large concerns about approaching a private entity, such as a Shell station, for example, and informing the owner and operator there that they have priority over the use of that fuel, even though they're paying for it. So in a state-declared emergency, our governor does assume complete control over all emergency operations under her resource management authorities. So the governor can control, restrict, and regulate the use of fuel. So we are working to clarify what the county's authority is with the Oregon Department of Justice. So we're likely going to develop a governor's directive authorizing the counties to do that. And one of ODO's priorities was to bring bulk fuel supply in from outside of the region to support the state's emergency response activities. And since fuel is not one of the common disaster relief commodities that's a part of the federal push strategy, we do have to work with US DOE and FEMA's Incident Management Assessment Team to request that bulk fuel supply. And that's what we did during the exercise. We practiced bringing in fuel to the incident support base in Redmond, and from there we sent the fuel out to 3 state staging areas, and then from there to 8 fuel points of distribution in the impacted areas. And I don't think this is very realistic, but what we're doing is walking through the process and the procedures to see if there are any glitches. But by day 3 of the exercise, the FEMA IMAT teams reported that they were able to deliver 450,000 gallons of fuel to the Redmond airport, and thereafter, on a daily basis, 250,000 gallons of fuel would be provided into Redmond to be disseminated at the state's direction. So from during this process, we were advised that some of our fuel points of distribution weren't adequate for, or weren't the most favorable for receiving unleaded and diesel gasoline, only because airports only support the storage and dispensing of aviation gas and jet fuel. So we didn't realize that. So we're going to re-look at all our pre-designated fuel distribution points to make sure that if it's an airport, we're going to have to order the right bladder trucks or apparatus to support storage and dispensing of fuel. But it's the FEMA IMATS team's recommendation that if whenever possible, designate public works yards, motor pools, and those locations that's already geared up to receive and store unleaded and diesel fuel. Now, one of the things that's vital is we understand that the initial response will be an air response, but restoring the state's transportation corridors are crucial to reconnecting our major population bases within the state. So truck transport of disaster release supplies is essential to our ability to sustain our ongoing emergency response and move forward with recovery activities, and especially delivering fuel to our priority users. So during this exercise, we did review with the Oregon Department of Transportation their lifeline routes, and what you're looking at are the Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 priority routes. We've walked through protocols with ODOT and the Oregon Public Utility Commission to send out road crews, because we're going to have to work together to restore those infrastructure. And without roads, communications crews and utility crews can't get into these areas to restore their power lines and communication towers. So we're going to collaborate and following ODOT's priority lifeline routes to try to restore these critical infrastructure lifelines and services. So some of our next steps is verifying that our pre-designated state staging areas and our fuel pods align with the ODOT lifeline routes, and to work with the counties to ensure that their local priority routes connect with the state lifeline routes. So one of the counties that we worked with was Marion County, who has a very comprehensive local fuel plan. And part of the reason why they have such a comprehensive plan is they have received grants from US DOE in the past to do their energy assurance plan, and this is some of their focus, and they've been working closely with us to make sure that their county plan integrates with our state fuel plan. So they've identified their priority routes that actually link to the state routes. They've designated fueling locations to receive bulk fuel supplies along those critical routes to make sure that they can actually get commodities in addition to fuel to the county area. And our next steps is to ensure that all of the counties, especially those west of the Cascades, are prepared like Marion County is. And Marion County and some of the other counties who are more prepared and have more comprehensive plans have agreed to share their plans with some of our other counties who don't have either the resources to do this planning or time. During the exercise, we also looked at options to move fuel by water and by rail, but these options do take more time. Routinely, there are barges transporting fuel from the Portland Fuel Hub to eastern Washington to a terminal in Pasco, Washington. Post-Cascadia, we can expect that a number of these barges will be trapped upriver from down bridges and debris in the Portland area. So the plan is to use these barges as storage facilities that can offload and for use to support emergency response efforts. The question will be how many barges will be available and how quickly can we bring in a bulk fuel supply to leverage this asset. We'll also discuss the possibility of delivering fuel into the impacted areas by rail. This option is also limited by the number of available rail cars and the condition of the tracks after a Cascadia earthquake. The idea is to bring rail cars near the affected area to be used as temporary storage, and then the fuel can also be offloaded from the rail cars to trucks for delivery into the impacted areas. And our next step is to continue working the details of these options to determine if they're viable, and if so, to include that in our plan. There are also maritime assets that we can request to assist in restoring our ports or building temporary ports so that we can receive disaster relief supplies, equipment, personnel along our coast and major waterways. And we did learn that the Navy does have assets that can provide us with housing, fueling stations, emergency power, firefighting capabilities, and a number of other assistance. But a lot of these, or some of these assets will take anywhere from a week to 30 days from the time we order these assets to arrive on the Oregon coast. So there's a lot of work that we're going to have to do to either request and get ready to make sure we have these things in place to request these assets early and coordinate that with all the other state agencies that will need support and have responsibilities to provide that support. We're also learned from Hurricane Sandy that the Jones Act was lifted so that 11 foreign vessels could ship 115 million gallons of fuel from the U.S. Gulf Coast to the ports in New York and New Jersey. So during this exercise, we also discussed the process for lifting the Jones Act and the possibility of having these foreign vessels deliver fuel to the Oregon coast. The challenge is that none of our Oregon coastal ports are likely to survive the tsunami wave, so we're going to have to identify locations to put up temporary ports. So our next step here is to coordinate with all the appropriate federal, military, and state agencies to talk about the process, identify and review our state's port plan, and to better request and be prepared to receive these maritime assets. Finally, during the exercise, we also identified and reviewed 16 potential safety, environmental, and fair market regulations that may need to be waived to ensure timely delivery of fuel and other disaster relief commodities. Some require coordination with federal agencies as well as state agencies. Others are simply in-state requirements that we need to coordinate with state agencies to make sure that we can lift them in a timely manner. So right now we have all these 16 waivers into the Department of Justice, who's reviewing them to see what the state needs to do to ensure that we can streamline the process and get it done quickly. So pending the outcome of DOJ's review, we'll coordinate with the appropriate federal and state agencies to draft boilerplate waivers so that they're all ready to go when we need them. And in closing, Cascadia Rising clearly showed that the state agencies are geared towards supporting the counties and the local agencies as we should be, but our big gap is we need to improve on our coordination among state agencies. What happened during the exercise, and it became very clear to us that as our agency was working to move fuel into the impacted areas, so was the Department of Human Services trying to move food and water. Oregon Health Authority was trying to move medical supplies. We are kind of doing that independently, and we finally realized that we needed to stop and really coordinate together, because this Cascadia scenario requires that we collaborate, because there are only so many places that we can send these supplies to initially. So we are working in a more collaborative effort now, and the governor has designated a state resiliency officer to kind of guide statewide efforts to ensure that there's an overall improvement in coordination, whether it's for our immediate response or long-term resiliency work. So there are a lot of lessons learned on the petroleum front from these two exercises, and now there's a lot more work that needs to be done to kind of apply these lessons learned into our plan. That kind of wraps up my presentation. I appreciate the opportunity to share it with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Deanna. Appreciate that. And next up is Jeff with DOE.
Thank you. And Robert, Deanna, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and the lessons learned. It's clear that you are making good progress in closing some of those gaps that you've identified and working through the Cascadia scenario. One thing I wanted to note about ClearPath specifically for the Department of Energy, it not only focused on the energy sector response to this Cascadia subduction zone earthquake tsunami scenario, it also allowed us to focus a little bit on ourselves. So we have recently implemented a unified command structure within the department to be able to access all the subject matter expertise across the department, including the 17 DOE national labs, the power marketing administrations, and subject matter specific expertise, even in renewable energy offices or fossil energy offices. And the exercise, ClearPath exercise, allowed us to really test that and be able to access those experts and get them up to speed on how we conduct response coordination from a federal level. This is just a quick overview of the participants in ClearPath. I'm not going to dwell on it. We have that available publicly for those that are interested, but we're very proud and very thankful for all the people that were able to participate, and look forward to even more stakeholders in the upcoming ClearPath this spring, which I will get to in a minute. These are recommendations that came out in DOE's public report, and I'm not going to touch on every one of them, but I do want to highlight a couple of things that we're doing that I'd like the community at large to know about, and hopefully get people plugged into the next iterations or the valuable programs and products that are coming out of some of the ClearPath activities. Really, looking at this slide, I'd like to, that our interaction with the energy sector is constant and ongoing, but in connecting to the response communities in different stakeholders, both electricity and oil and natural gas industries, the scenario really highlighted both the interdependency and the enhanced knowledge that's needed of constraints in each of those subsectors. And we want to make sure that DOE is doing a good job in helping share that knowledge. This is all in our publicly available ClearPath After Action Lessons Learned report. The thing that I'd like to point out on this one is really getting back to our test of the unified command structure, and we're trying to, after lessons learned from as long ago as Sandy to things that we've learned in Hurricane Matthew this year, we're doing a better job at putting personnel with subject matter expertise at state regions, both in steady state and in response, and gathering lessons learned and best practices from you all that have a more hands-on role, and we're really attempting to learn from you how we can best support your efforts to interact with the energy industry and bring the energy industry into conversations that gain value for you and vice versa. It's one of the reasons why we've partnered with NEMA and NASIO, and as Robert mentioned, the National Governors Association. We have a couple other partnerships that I'll get to in a minute. The energy sector focus of ClearPath really, as Deanna pointed out, led to being able to test different functions and different interactions during Cascadia Rising. And from a federal Department of Energy perspective, this was really important to us because we were able to focus more on the transportation interdependencies. Craig and others at FEMA like to stress that power is, the #1 thing after life and safety, and getting that back on really fuels the rest of the response. But if we don't have access into those key areas to fix the infrastructure or to create the patches that we need to bring the system back up, there's going to be no power. So, you know, we don't like to think of ourselves as priority number 2 behind life and safety, because these days it's so interdependent, and especially in this scenario where you have large breaks, large cracks, large bridges that are impassable. You know, it really highlighted the transportation issue. And one thing Deanna mentioned was the damage assessment. And so I'd like to just highlight our work in working with the Federal Interagency to get imagery that we can analyze and provide states and other energy stakeholders with basically damage assessment in the form of heat maps, where damage is likely to have occurred, and we're really excited about building this out using the science from some of the national labs to hopefully get that out in the next year. The other thing I'd like to mention, because Deanna spent a good amount of time on waivers, and the federal waivers were an obvious issue during Cascadia Rising, and knowledge of what was capable and what the department could help facilitate expedited restoration with certain waivers, or interacting with DHS and Coast Guard and EPA on completing waivers, really slowed down some of the response. So Matt Duncan, our State Energy Assurance Program Manager, is actually going to be working on this issue and making sure that our website is up to date with a kind of waivers, resources, and education section, and explaining what some of those are and how to get that accomplished quickly and efficiently during response. Of course, that's all dependent on knowing where that is and knowing how to access it ahead of time, and transition into the education and training. You know, some of the things that we would like to work on with states through NEMA and NASIO over the coming year. Some of our priorities are identified on this slide, specifically the education and training. I think that the department has a responsibility to provide access, to know how to get those waivers, how to request those waivers the fastest way, and really the capabilities across the federal government. So we're really going to focus on providing the right education and training so that we can support you properly. Deanna talked a lot about the fuel allocation, so I won't harp on that too much. The other, I guess I have 2 more things on this slide that I'd like to touch on. Really, it's the State Emergency Management Agency's bullet, bringing together the community, you know, the community around the energy sector. So energy touches so many different sectors and different parts of the government that our big focus is really going to be using our Energy Emergency Assurance Coordinators agreement that Department of Energy Secretary Moniz signed earlier this year to bring together the NASIAs, the NEMAs, the governors, and other partners in sharing different perspectives on energy and how we can support each other in responding. Which brings me to the last point, that we will definitely have a focus to help states update their energy assurance plans, whether that's providing access to technical expertise at labs or within the department, or you know, state energy officials, or lessons learned, best practices. That's definitely going to be a priority for us over the coming year. we'll touch on a couple of things that we have coming up that specifically are an outcome of lessons learned. I already talked to the second bullet, the Energy Emergency Assurance Coordinators Agreement. We're really excited about that, and it has reinvigorated some of our relationships and really spurred our efforts in this area. The top one that Matt will kill me if I don't get to immediately is Liberty Eclipse exercise coming up that we have in Newport, Rhode Island, December 8th and 9th. While it is a cyber-focused event, one of the big takeaways for us was the lack of oil and natural gas inputs in some of the state plans and just local plans in general, and so we've made that a focus where the scenario is going to, the cyber scenario is going to impact some pipelines and maybe spur some really good discussions around fuel and oil and natural gas, heating oil, that type of thing. So we're real excited about that and have tweaked that scenario to ensure that we're capturing some of the lessons learned from ClearPath and Cascadia. As I mentioned, the EEAC has really spurred the cooperative agreements that we have on, and we're hoping to better blanket all of our stakeholders and partners in the energy sector. I mentioned the waiver library, technical assistance. The last thing I'll highlight on this slide, the final bullet, Eagle Eye, actually stands for the Environment of Analysis of Geolocated Energy Infrastructure. We will not have a test on that, so you can just call it Eagle Eye. But it is the department's tool for situational awareness regarding distribution level outages. And we have about 75% coverage of the customers within the United States and are looking to expand that and looking to add capabilities to that tool. And one of them is what we're internally calling Eagle Eye Open. And that we'll start with a pilot project in the next couple months to allow states access into the Eagle Eye system to share our situational awareness and maybe enable a little bit more collaboration on what is out, why it's out, how we can work together to restore it quickly, and also place limited resources in a more efficient, smart way, knowing what areas are going to be out for the longer duration. And I'd like to highlight the next ClearPath event and encourage everyone to get involved if they can. It is May 16th and 17th of the coming spring. We're going to focus in the southeast. It's going to revert to a hurricane scenario so that we can maybe test some lessons learned from the recent Matthew, and also educate some of our new political partners in how to respond to a common or likely scenario. The major focus for this year will be cross-sector coordination. We've had some amazing partners step up in the telecommunications and transportation subsectors and are engaging with water, and hope that those three will really, we will really be able to test the interdependency between energy and those three sectors. So we're looking forward to it. Would love to get anybody involved that can. It's a shameless plug on my part, but we're really excited about exercising catastrophic incidents in a regional way that brings together states and the energy stakeholders to identify and gain some of the valuable lessons that Robert and Deanna shared earlier. There's our contact information there, slide 10. Again, my name is Jeff Baumgartner. Matt Duncan is our program manager, and we look forward to interacting and meeting each of you.
Jeff, thank you, and thanks to all of our speakers. We will take a couple of minutes to answer some questions. We do have a couple of questions already, and Robert, the first one is directed to you. And the question is, how do you get stakeholders to embrace a different planning paradigm? And do you have any best practices to get stakeholders to realize this isn't just a regular response?
Really good question, Trina. And I have to confess that before Cascadia Rising, we were already kind of starting to shift our focus toward push, realizing, you know, what this was going to do for us. But the exercise really brought that into crystal clear focus. And I think it's just a lot of hard legwork. It's meeting with our stakeholders, being consistent in the message, educating. We had the advantage that there was a regional catastrophic planning grant that came to this area for about 6 years, from about 2007 through about 2013, that some legwork was done, and we were already thinking about a lot of this, but you know, it's just hard work, going out, talking with people, beating the drum, and I think that the science is there to back us up how bad this is going to be. So, you know, it's a matter of being consistent and on message, and people get it.
Great. Robert, another question for you. What are the considerations, and I assume this is for public messaging, but what are the considerations for alternate communication if TV, social media, and phones are down?
Again, this is something that that we really truly need to work our way through. We've got a pretty robust ham radio network here in the state that local and state emergency managers can tap into, so we will at least have some rudimentary communications on that level. We've got some public safety networks that we think at least partially will be able to survive the disaster. So, you know, at a government level, are we going to be able to have free, open, easy communications? Absolutely not, but we will have a very limited ability to communicate. Now, from the perspective of being able to communicate out to the public, that is going to be a huge challenge, and it's something that we need to plan for and get our arms around. But I know that we've got some very innovative local emergency managers who are organizing around communities with ham radios to post messages and to make sure that the public is aware of critical information about, you know, where points of distribution will be for food and supplies. And so this is something that we just need to continue to work on to build a much more robust system that's going to be in place across the state to make sure that our public gets the messaging that they need to be able to handle the disaster.
Okay, thank you. A question for Deanna. The questioner says most of these issues, power, fuel distribution, critical infrastructure, communications, etc., were also experienced in 2012 during Hurricane Sandy. Has anyone in Oregon been able to reach out to municipalities, refiners, power generation, in the New York, New Jersey area to see how they handled that and learn from their lessons?
We have used the lessons learned from the USDOE reports, and we've been going through our process with our local folks, but no, that's a great recommendation, and we need to connect with those folks.
Thank you. A question for Jeff. Is DOE going to offer additional mitigation funding to assist the public sector in updating or increasing their energy preparedness planning efforts?
We would obviously love to be able to offer that type of assistance. Our budgets are obviously controlled outside of our office, and we're dependent on help from others. But you know, if you look at some of our requests over 16 and FY17, you'll definitely see that language in our requests, and one of these times we hope it will come through and we can provide more preparedness activities and assistance.
Okay, thank you. Was the role of community preparedness addressed during the exercise? And moving forward, what are some of the planned efforts to make communities more engaged and prepared?
Well, community preparedness in respect to the fuel sector, Yes and no. We have been now coordinating with Oregon Health Authority and the Department of Human Services to ensure that communities are more involved. And we brought in Mercy Corps, and Mercy Corps handles international events, and they have been very insightful for us because they are telling us that we do need to involve our communities and prepare them better, because initially after a catastrophic earthquake, shelters may not likely be established as quickly because of access, but what's going to happen is they're going to be community shelters or home shelters that they were calling. And it would be neighbors getting together with neighbors, those with generators. And so we're starting that process right now. So those are all the things that this is such a huge thing to get our arms around, but those are the kinds of things that we're starting to talk about.
Okay, thank you. And Deanna, another question for you, and I apologize, I'm having trouble understanding this question, but it involves the Marine Transportation System Recovery Unit. And were they part of your exercise in terms of planning for any necessary rerouting of products during the disaster?
We worked with our Oregon Military Department and some of the federal response teams and the Military Defense Logistics Agency folks that came into our center. I don't believe we had an actual person from the Maritime Administration at our center to talk through. So those are all the things that we gathered from our exercise that we're going to have to follow up on, get additional information so that we can better prepare for how to request and receive. And we do know that a big part of the state and local responsibility is we can order these assets, but we have to have the ability to receive them.
Thank you. And this question is really open to any of our panelists. The question is, did these efforts also result in conclusions and recommendations for pre- and post-disaster resilience?
Well, this is Robert. I'd like to take a stab at that. I think that we definitely need to focus on building resiliency in all of our infrastructure sectors going forward: transportation, fuel, energy, all of them. And in Washington, our governor has just announced the formation of a sub-cabinet looking at trying to build resiliency here in Washington State. So very similar to the initiative that just took place in Oregon. And so this sub-cabinet group will be taking a look at key sectors and looking going forward what we can do to build infrastructure, because I think that, or build resiliency, I'm sorry, because I think that it's very clear coming out of the exercise that something that survives the event is a heck of a lot better than something you're going to have to find a workaround for when it doesn't survive the event. And
this is Jeff. I'll just add two things from DOE's perspective. One, a lot of the lessons learned that we gathered from a federal level ended up in our quadrennial energy review that will come out in December as policy recommendations and maybe some attempted changes there. And internally to our office, we also worked to fund Brookhaven National Lab to develop a process and framework for how we could better support resilience efforts both in mitigation and restoration, recovery, in mitigation and recovery during the planning process, ways that we can maybe identify new technologies, new science that can be built in on the front end in an energy assurance plan or even in a response plan, so that people are aware of how to rebuild smartly or harden ahead of time.
Okay, thank you. I see we've reached our time today. I want to thank all of our panelists who did an excellent job. I want to thank all of our participants. And again, you can review this and other NEMA presentations on the NEMA YouTube channel, NEMA for You.